Okay, so the recording is in progress. Yeah. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, everyone, wherever you are in the world. This is the 8th and last session of the course Tools for Post-Conflict Urban Recovery Ukraine, organized by TU Delft in collaboration with UN, Ukraine, the Netherlands Urban Network, Royal Melbourne Institute of Technology in Australia, Aalto University, and our Ukrainian partners. My name is Pavlo Gorokhovsky. I'm an architect. I'm from Ukraine. I work as an advisor in the Dutch Board of Government Advisor, College van Rijksvizier, which deals with urgent topics of today, from the energy transition to bio-based construction, from sustainable mobility to new cultural landscapes in the city. And since February last year, we have also focused on the dignified recovery of Ukraine. I'm also a team member of UN, an organization that initiated this course. Ukraine, the Netherlands Urban Network is a platform for Ukrainians in Dutch and Dutch special professionals who have joined forces to gain and exchange knowledge and build capacity in the context of the reconstruction of Ukraine. We're just over a year old, but we have already managed to organize a number of lectures, courses, symposiums, and studio visits. We as UN strive for a modern, sustainable, and flourishing Ukraine as a part of European Union. So we seek to cooperate with the best practices in universities in the world, such as TU Delft. This course seeks to discuss special strategies for an integrated urban recovery in post-conflict settings, investigating the process of reconstruction and what the notion of building back better implies, tackling inequalities, strengthening the capacities of local actors, and pursuing a green, resilient, and inclusive urban recovery anchored on sound spatial planning, design, and policy. In the development of base of this course, we wanted to use the term post-conflict as an open term that allows us to converse with the colleagues not only from Ukraine, but also from other areas affected by conflict and violent shocks. However, it is important to acknowledge that language has been used as a tool for disinformation and the erosion of public debate. And we want to fully acknowledge that what is going on in Ukraine at the moment is a full, senseless, and tragic war, perpetrated by a madman of a fully sovereign state. While the war is not yet over, we want to salute our friends and colleagues from Ukraine who bravely bear the burdens of this war and whom we wish to wholeheartedly support. All instructors in this course are working voluntarily as a service of reconstruction of Ukraine and in support of our Ukrainian friends and colleagues. So this is our 8th and last session. It's the title of today's session is Land and Policy as a Tool for Recovery. And today our lectures are actually, one of them you already know from the first lecture, Dr. Julia Lawson, who is an adjunct professor of the Center for Urban Research at RMIT University, Melbourne. Julia is the lead author of the UN report Housing 2030 by UNICEF, UN Habitat, and Housing Europe, and co-author of the report Rebuilding a Place to Call Home, published recently by PBL, the Netherlands Environmental Assessment Agency. Her interests including international cooperative research, urban development, land and housing policy, and social housing finance. And our Ukrainian speaker is Oleksandr Anisimov, who is a Ukrainian urban researcher, co-organizer and author of several articles in a publication after socialist modernism, architecture, planning, and urban design of the 1980s. And he is currently a doctoral researcher at Aalto University in Finland. I hope the introduction is correct. Thank you very much. And Julia and Alexander, the floor is yours.
Oh, it's good to be back and right at the end of the session. So fantastic that there's still so many people involved, and I see loads of people also obviously from Ukraine as well. So I'm glad that so far you found it interesting enough to stay the course and this last session on all important land policy. I'm going to share my screen right now. Okay, there we go. Everybody can see that clearly?
Yes.
Okay. All right. We'll move right into it because, of course, it's the end of your day and you've probably spent a lot of time working already, probably at volunteering or busy with issues related to crisis and recovery. So we'll try to make this as interesting and worthwhile for you as possible, and focus on the issues that hopefully are interesting for you and certainly worthwhile to learn about. Now, I'm trying to move through my slides.
Maybe what you can do, just like try to turn it on and off again. It happened last time as well, so maybe this can help.
What, on and off?
Yeah, just like the sharing of the screen.
Okay. Hmm.
You cannot switch it off?
Yeah, we'll work it out.
I can switch it off if you want.
Yeah, I can.
Okay, you did.
Okay, and we're going to go for it again. And how's that?
Yeah, try to switch the slide.
Yeah, I'm just,
yes,
there we go.
Yes.
Right, okay.
Great.
So I don't know about you, but I've got half the screen which is covered by people. So we'll sort that one out. But there's a lot of you out there, and it's incredible. There's almost, almost 100. So that's marvelous. So the main focus of today is to critically understand the role of land policy and its challenges, also during crisis, conflict, and war. And secondly, to be aware of relevant tools. So we're going to try to get as practical as we can as well, and their role in recovery. So first, a bit of sort of approaches, moral compass, where do we go? And then we're going to move on to actual tools and how they can be utilized. But then we're also going to then focus on what about in relevant insights in crisis situations in particular. We're going to look at two cases. One is East Timor, and two is Ukraine. So hang on for the ride, and along the way, we'll be drawing on some interesting studies. I take a lot of, I have a lot of books, as you can see, but one of the ones I found pretty useful is on this topic, is one by Benjamin Davey. He's a professor of, and now he's an emeritus professor of urban planning in Germany, but he's very, very clear and practical, as well as quite theoretically and conceptually strong. His book in Land Policy, Planning and Spatial Consequences of Property is a great book. If you can get hold of it. I'm drawing on just chapter 1 here. Also, the report which I wrote with Hanu Ruanavara called Land Policy for Affordable Inclusive Housing. That's a easily downloadable. If you search on that, I think it's under the Smart Land. You can see what the cover looks like. But basically, that's a small encyclopedia of tools and illustrations of those tools. But it's worth having a look. This presentation will go eventually on the website, and all of these are web links. So you can get through to the reports easy. And it's been mentioned, Housing 2030. There's a great chapter on land, which is a condensed essay, if you like, has behind it a website and with lots of podcasts. 3 of them are on land policy, which are worth listening, and also fun when you don't feel like reading, you can just listen. And I'm going to draw on a case study from East Timor. And later on, Oleksandr Anisimov, who we're really lucky to have with us, he's going to talk about his report, which he wrote with others, Rebuilding a Place to Call Home, because a big part of that is about also land governance and land instruments. So during this course today, we're going to use that Mentimeter thing. Well, we're going to try anyway. We're going to do our best. We've got 3 interesting, curious, curly questions to have a go at. So if you go to that menti.com, and then there's the, the code 5220 2326, so 5220-2326, or use the QR code. And then you can have a go in these little surveys along the way, and it's kind of fun to see what each other think about things. So in the beginning, what is land? Well, we all know that it's something we can't do without. It's critical, it's a finance resource, it's a fixed thing in place. We have varying control over it. Some have lots, some have little, some have access, some don't. It also might have a certain usage or a desired usage that affects its development and also its cost, its value. And of course, it can be valued in different ways. But one thing we know is that it's integral to economic and social well-being. But even though it's important for living planet and also the way in which we live and share, it's also something which is very commodified and subject to who owns what and how it's traded, who's been sitting on it for a long time, what it's subject to. Perhaps that's sitting behind it are some mortgages, maybe a lease contract. Maybe someone's determined what the use might be and it's subject to a planning system even. And there might be development rights. So somebody's potentially hanging on to it to use it for something. And perhaps even doing nothing with it in the meantime. So of course it's subject to lots of different relationships. Some of them are very collaborative and helpful to communities, and some of them are very unhelpful. We also have, of course, powerful oligarchies which hang on to things and don't let them go and don't allow them to be used for useful things. But in some countries, that land ownership use is better regulated than others. In others, of course, especially during times of chaos or weak political regimes, we have haphazard development, ad hoc development, sprawl, land grabs, unserviced areas, neglected areas, and a lot of waste. So good land regulation is really, really important. But of course, it's all a bit of a struggle. And there is, of course, the big struggle going on between pure property rights and human rights. And I used to work for somebody called John Friedman, who was a well-known professor in urban planning. And he wrote about the way in which land use planning or urban planning could be part of something called social reform. We could use it just for policy analysis. We could learn a lot from it and just study it, but we could also use it as a way to reallocate power in society, hopefully for the collective good and not just for a few wealthy landowners. So as you get the message, how we think about land, of course, and who manages it and who owns it is really a central defining element. And this is one of my favorite quotes, which I've used in several books that I've written. And it's important because it underpins a lot of things that we do. It underpins, and it's also a really underrated concern in recovery efforts. It's not often a focus. We're often obsessed about where the money is coming from, but we don't look at the land under our feet, which determines what might be possible. So land policy is really powerful tool that sets the direction of change and helps address or actually makes problems and challenges. And of course, these things accumulate over long periods of time and get established in an inertia way of doing, in a way of believing in things. And of course, it's a historical, ideological, power, if you like, which has, very much the subject of struggles and often even the contests of war. So we have to look at land policies in history. We have to look at them in place. We have to understand the impact of what's going on around them, if you like, contingent circumstances, also things that might be of natural disasters, but as well as man-made disasters such as conflicts and war. So we know even that land policy itself is often a source of conflict, but we have to remember all the time that it's also a source of resolution and potentially social harmony as well. So these are the kind of things that John used to go on about what land policy and planning is supposed to be able to do. And it's helpful just to remind, the purpose of it all. And, there's many different ideas of what that purpose would be or should be. And some of the things that he used to talk about a lot was its role in economic stability, perhaps also in growth, its role in enabling or ensuring the space for key public services, social infrastructure, for example, its role in enabling that infrastructure to be placed on the ground, and also its role in that supportive infrastructure to support other things in life, economics, economic development, industry development, cultural activities, recreation, good living spaces, all those things. But also urban planning is also key to protecting us from toxic development, from living next to things which are harmful to us, from unrestrained market activity, from land grabs, as I mentioned before. It's also a way of redistributing development gains that might be made when we lay down a road, and it's not just those at the end of that road which benefit, but also the whole community. So it's a way of redistributing development gains. We do that all the time when we tax land, when we collect those resources at the municipal level, and when we reinvest them back in again. It's kind of the forgotten area, the forgotten role of land is actually reaping that value and to underpin a very healthy municipal form of government. Unfortunately, some have forgotten that, and that's why we end up with very underprovided for and poorly provided for communities. So using land effectively and its value for the common good is incredibly important. And also it's a way of protecting us from market failure. We step in to ensure that certain things happen through land policy. Otherwise, we would have, nothing but mega supermarkets on the edge of town and driving around in constant circles of traffic jams. So it's very, very important the way in which we use our land resources to address market failures. But of course, we know that not all land policy is good policy, and there's lots and lots of examples of really bad things going on. And I'm sure you can imagine, if you think about it, the way in which land policy affects the kind of homes that you live in, or the kind of neighborhoods you live in, how far away you are from your school or your kindergarten or your work. And all these things have to do with the way in which we plan our resources of land, the way in which we acquire that, we set aside and make space for things that matter to people. So land policy really impacts urban form and generates impacts and access to resources. It also promotes, of course, dispersal and single detached homes and sprawl, and requires, of course, very, very wasteful and excessive infrastructure to reach what somewhat isolated communities. And these patterns of development also have questions of exacerbate issues around the environment, or also inequality. They can erode biodiversity and reduce not only our quality of life, but also even our health, in the way in which we get stuck in cars, or, sitting on a really bad tram, waiting for a bus for 2 or 3 hours. So it's really important how we combine these things together, how we play a really important role, that land policy isn't something really boring and unimportant. It's actually really, really part and parcel of helping design a good community. But of course, there's lots of people that are talking about things in terms of what is a good community. And sometimes it's really hard to work out which bit to focus on. What is smart, what is sustainable, what's green, what's ethical. And, in these world rankings of cities, it's pretty confusing to work out, well, where does land policy fit in? And so we have to sort of work out, in discussion with our communities. Perhaps I won't show you this film, but it's worth having a look at it. Maybe this is actually, it's kind of cute actually, but I won't show it to you because I can't work out how to. But when you have time, when you eventually go to the website and you have time to explore it, please have fun with that lovely little graphic film, which is about business as usual or a more ethical city. So basically, most urban leaders, administrators, planners, and engineers are aware of the ethical ramifications of the work that they do, and they have some kind of vision or idea, hopefully instilled by some decent training or professional certification. But sometimes planners do fall foul of this. Not the majority, but there is a minority that are not doing the right thing. So what I want to ask you is to go to that Mentimeter thing and ask yourself, what is the justification for intervention in land markets? I'm going to try and switch now to another website. And this is the website. Can you see it?
No, we don't. Yeah, if you can also translate it again on the screen so people see the code.
Okay. What matters is if you have this code. Okay, so you go to menti.com and you type in 5220 2326. And hopefully something happens.
Yeah, the code is in the chat as well, guys. So
okay. Now, I think there's a bit of collective learning going on here right at the moment. So in terms of answering that question, you should be able to get that on your telephone or something like that. Is that correct?
Yes, yes.
You can? Can you answer it?
Yeah, but can you share the screen of Mentimeter or not? Or is it just...
Okay. How's that? Can you see that?
Yeah, now we see you. Yeah.
Okay.
We just did it for a second, Julie, but now then it was gone.
Okay, well, let's just try again. How's that? What can you see?
No, yeah, now we see you, Mentimeter.
Okay. Now, I have no idea what happens now, but essentially, Pavlo?
Yes, yes, I'm here.
Yeah, so I'm hoping we can view the results or start to view the results.
Yeah, the only thing is people are saying in the chat that the question is a bit different. Is it possible?
Yes.
Yeah, for some reason, Julie, the first question is what land policy tools could be useful for Ukraine recovery? That somebody might have put them in a different order or something.
Yeah, they should be. It should be. Okay. Well, I don't know why that happened. That's a pity. I see that 16 people have actually tried.
Yeah, we see now your
down,
screen.
Maybe.
Yeah. Can you see that?
Yeah.
Yeah, we can see that.
Okay. All right. All right. Now, Pavlo, can you just manage for 30 seconds while I open the door for some
yes, yes, yes. No, but then yeah, everybody knows what to do. Yeah, we also have the code on the chat. I think yeah, should work. But I don't see, well, I mean, we all see Julia's screen now, but I don't see votes growing.
Okay. All right. Can you see anything?
We see your screen with the Mentimeter right now, where we have 16 votes and 11 participants and 4 slides.
Okay. Okay. Well, hopefully people just answer, and maybe I can put the results on the website. Okay.
Yeah, that's what we always do. That's what we told you as
Okay.
well.
Alrighty. Now, oops. Okay, so shall we continue on?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay, so of course, in all of this discussion, you've got the international organizations who are telling us what we should think and do, and hopefully our governments are also engaged in that discussion.
Julia,
And
sorry for interrupting.
Yep.
Maybe you can switch the full screen to the presentation, because we now see,
Yeah.
to the full screen
So,
presentation.
Yeah, is that better?
No, now we see you, but you've been showing the, yeah, if you can just only share the presentation.
We propose to choose the monitor, not the program, when the introducing start.
And not the web browser. Yeah, exactly. Now it's good, but full screen. Thanks.
Okay.
Yes.
I'm sorry, that'll have to do. Okay, so of course it's very important what that discussions are, and we have 193 governments which have put their weight behind the Sustainable Development Goals. And it's not just the governments themselves, it's also cities, and it's also the corporate sector and private business and civil society in the new urban agenda. And so the kind of, you know, values, if you like, around urban inequality, addressing equality, access to opportunities and livable renewal, housing affordability and environmental stability, they're ones which are prominent and purposeful today. And the Sustainable Development Goals are also probably the most successful set of indicators and goals and targets which have been adopted by so many governments so far. So we see these ones being the ones that are really starting to take hold in government reporting, also at the local level, which is a great thing. Some universities, like my own, also put a lot of credence on these Sustainable Development Goals and even shape their performance indicators, measure their performance through those. So one of the initiatives towards the SDGs for 2030 is, of course, Housing 2030. And I'm going to focus on its land policy tools with regards to housing and walk you through those and some examples before turning to their use in recovery and an application to 2 cases. So what kind of tools? We mentioned also in the outline of the course that we were going to look at public land banking and purposeful development, public land leasing and conditional use, land readjustment, guiding effective redevelopment, land value recapture, reinvesting those gains with purpose, planning affordable inclusive housing, and also neighbourhood planning agreements, often involving a combination of all those different tools. So with regards to the Housing 2030 report, you'll find that in those tools you define, also building on the Lawson and Ruanavara report, and a number of examples are given in the use of the tool, and it's also its pros and cons, its advantages and disadvantages. It's considered a tool rather than a blueprint, something which is to be applied and adapted to different contexts. So land banking involves the purchase or expropriation of private land to secure and potentially change development rights and influence land prices, often making certain types of development more feasible or more organised. It's undertaken by both private and also public land development and building companies, i.e. state land agencies, and as well as private development agencies. But public land banking involves the direct invention in the land market usually by some form of development corporation, and which has, say, a board of public governance which might be operated under a mandate from the government or from the municipal government, which sets the direction to meet certain public interest goals. There are many of these types of land bankers in the world, and the most famous, of course, is Singapore's land banker, which has been responsible for resettling informal settlements and then leasing and redeveloping that land for public home ownership for the past 50, 60 years. We've also got more recent examples, like in Vienna, which since 1991 has established a housing land fund from which it actively purchases land that it needs for its strategic plan and ensures that there are sufficient sites across the city, not in certain only parts, but across the city, to integrate different segments of the housing needs and ensure that they're not forgotten or avoided. And for example, they make sure that there's sufficient housing for much needed key workers in healthcare, in nursing, for example, something which their aging population desperately needs. So having sufficient affordable homes so that people can live close to the care and the jobs that they do, the worthwhile jobs that they do, is really, really important in Vienna. And they have a land banker which makes sure that within the city boundaries, those kind of homes are possible. We also see a strong, long history of land, what they call grondbedrijven in the Netherlands. So I don't know if you know, but actually the first form of actual governance in the Netherlands was a group of people getting together around pieces of land to prevent themselves from basically drowning or sinking into the bog. So they had to form cooperative associations, verenigingen of, and this is, I think, since 1666 is the oldest form of government in the Netherlands. Well, they went on eventually to become effective water boards and also influence the way in which government was, formed and decided in the Netherlands. But one of the things they're very good at there is active land policy, in the way in which they take on a driving role in preparing land, providing infrastructure, allocating that land to ensure that the kind of needs are addressed. And I can tell you that it makes an enormous difference to the shape of cities in the Netherlands. If you've ever travelled from the Netherlands and taken a train and gone to Brussels, you'll see the enormous difference in the quality of the urban environment between compact, neat and tidy, the Netherlands, and sprawling, sorry for the Belgians in the audience, but sprawling, untidy, rather messy, low density housing, often self-built, not necessarily very well or maintained in Belgium. So you see quite a difference between the way in which our land resources are used in compact, the Netherlands, versus sprawling, fragmented Belgium. Very obvious. And the big difference there is the role of these land corporations, grondbedrijven, they call them. In Australia too, we had those land corporations. They were really, really important, especially in the 70s, in establishing the development of the city in parallel with its economic development. And we had whole suburbs. In fact, we named some of them after the Queen of England, Elizabeth. Elizabeth is a suburb which is entirely developed by the South Australian Housing Trust and the Land Trust there. But in modern day, we see the masters of this process being the Chinese municipal land bankers, who've learned how to use control over land and land leasing and land uses for their growth machine, sometimes going into overdrive and creating ghost cities of unoccupied houses as well. So this is very, very key, in which from nothing, in a sense, from they've created use value. That use value they've been able to capitalize on and attract investment to build housing, whether or not they needed it or not. But the fact is that they're able to create some value and direct it to what they thought was important. Here's the example of Singapore. I won't go into too much detail because there's so much there, and it's such an interesting example. Some people have actually even touted it as a model for I remember in the early days of discussions around recovery plans for Ukraine, even Singapore was mentioned. Why was it mentioned? Well, there's lots of interesting things in its land banking, its land resettlement, the way it uses the land assets, also the way in which its housing development companies work, the way in which it's been able to foster what we would call positive circuits of investment for the common good. Also in terms of the provision of healthcare through subsidiary funds and education and so on. So they've created very well organized, extremely well organized, perhaps for some people too well organized, patterns of production of homes and consumption of services. Really interesting to look at that in detail. And I mentioned Wohnfonds, the Vienna Land Procurement and Urban Renewal Body, which actually was of interest in the PBL report, which might be mentioned later. There's some developments from Wohnfonds. Oh, I didn't realize I had an animation on this. So, actually, there's some amazing developments going on there. We were only there 10 days ago in Vienna taking more photographs, and they've been able to utilize old railway lines, which are no longer needed in the heart of the city, and convert them for housing, really beautiful housing with loads of greenery, playgrounds, schools, space for social infrastructure, little cooperative cafes and vegetable gardens, different forms of housing, all very high quality, affordable rental and also ownership housing. So public land leasing is another tool that's used. And you might not know this, but in around about 1949, after all the chaos going on after the Second World War in Denmark and having to resettle populations, lots of overcrowding because people were staying with friends and doubling up in rooms. Homes were deteriorating, quality of homes were rather poor at that time. So what was enacted to help facilitate much more organized and healthy and purposeful development was to give municipalities the power to become a land purchaser, to acquire development sites that were not going anywhere, to acquire farms that were on the immediate edge of town and didn't have to be used for farms anymore, but could be used for better purposes, and to organize the infrastructure to them and the permit and land use and also their redevelopment. So Helsinki today owns about 70% of the land around the city. And it's got its future in its own hands. It also earns considerable resources from owning those land plots. I have some figures on that here later. But you see also Munich waking up to the importance of doing something like this. And they've now got a socially just land policy, which no longer sells the land, but rather purposefully leases it. And also Barcelona, which is really exciting to watch, is trying to do what it can. It's a strong, well-resourced, capable, intelligent municipality that's really punching on a global stage in terms of what it's doing for land policy and housing. But it's also making space for cooperatives and smaller initiatives, collaborative initiatives, making sure that there are sites for, groups of friends even to collaborate on the design of a community. So not just that a residential development that might be owned by a global real estate investment trust, but also space for cooperatives and communities to thrive. And I think that's really wonderful. So here's a little bit of facts and figures from the city of Helsinki, but you might notice down the bottom that they receive an income of 350 to 400 million euros a year from the land leasing agreements that they have. And that's money that they can spend on decent kindergartens, good schools, playgrounds, quality public administration. So it's a virtuous circle, the fact that they actually own and lease this land. And of course, by leasing it, it doesn't mean that it's only leased for rental housing. They also offer it for long-term right of occupancy housing, which also is this kind of form of home ownership in a way, where you don't own the whole thing, but you own a big part of it, and therefore you don't have to pay quite so much for it. It gives you stability and a sense of belonging, perhaps a sense that you can renovate or change the home the way you like it. So leasing doesn't mean that it's only about rental housing. People on there live and belong there for many, many years. This is one of my favorite examples, which is an area in Vancouver called False Creek. False Creek was an area of land which was blocked by a new bridge, which could no longer form the economic purpose that it did. And the way in which they planned that area was so marvelous. It included all kinds of housing options and community activities, commercial spaces, artistic spaces, cultural. And it's I've been there almost every 5 years of my grown-up life to see how things are going. And it's been really nice to watch that community move actually through the era. But it is on leased land, and the government has ambitions now that the lease is coming to an end. Will that community stay? What will happen? And it brings up the issue of how long-term are these lease contracts? How much do they, if you like, reinvigorate, innovate, or improve over time? It would be devastating for that community to have to be redeveloped for more denser forms of housing. So one of the things with leasing that's really important is how we keep abreast of the time and keep improving the assets and the environment that's there, created through this leasehold system. You can read a bit more about this on the website later. Another one is the big development in Vienna, and a massive community, I think around 23,000 people. And this has also involved lots of purposeful segments, different forms of housing and ways of living, from the big, major developments to smaller cooperatives and group homes. There seems to be at least an ambition to involve the community in it. There's been quite a bit of community engagement in the process, early completion of the public transport to get out there in the beginning. It's predominantly rental housing, but there's also lots of student housing and home ownership, as well as education, cultural, employment opportunities. So it's interesting. And again, here's some more facts and figures if you're interested in, maps looking into it as a case study. And you'll find a lot of material about this one on the website as well. So finally, moving to public land pooling. So of course you have bits and pieces of land fragmented that might not be used, or might be that requires someone to step in and show some vision, some leadership, some coordination, where the private initiative just isn't going anywhere. So land pooling and readjustment is the kind of really wonderful thing for entrepreneurial planners, because it lets them, really get in there and make something happen. And we see a long tradition of this in Germany, which has and also a strong successes recently in Asia. For example, I used to live in Korea and studied also post-war development there. It was largely destroyed Seoul in 1953, and planning and land policy instruments quite some years later, became very, very important in modernizing, recovering the city. It took them a long time to respond to the needs of their dwellers in the city, 20 years of virtual dictatorship. And until in the 70s, they did respond to supporting a better quality a way of living. It's very interesting to look at the kind of laws and instruments that they use then. But you don't have to go that far. You can also just look in Germany, which has got this land readjustment national law, which backs a binding implementation of local land use plans. So learn about that, and you'll find the real expert, the global expert, I think, on this land readjustment business is actually is Benjamin Davies, the emeritus professor. And if you want to hear the man himself talk about it, there's a lecture by him on this Talking About Land series, which is a really fantastic way to learn about land policy. So you can go to the housing agency and type in Talking About Land series, and then there's about 6 or 7 if you're really hungry for this, it's like 6 or 7 versions of what I'm trying to do for you in 30 minutes, and where there's 3 speakers on each topic, and where there's great slides you can download and all that. So it's very, very useful. But there are steps in land readjustment, which are defined here as the area where the readjustment has to occur, freezing the changes in the land uses, transferring the rights of the land, mapping all the properties, mapping all the landowners, finding out what did they have at that point in time. It's really important that that be registered well, so you know who owned what and how much was it worth. And then the process goes, hopefully that's a friendly process, and it's not involving land grabbing, but it's one in which you do it in consultation, you do it with a common vision, and you do it with the good faith and trust that they will be able to return to that space, but it will be reorganized and redeveloped to suit a group of landowners or the wider community. So basically that reformulated, repackaged land is then redesignated. What is needed is reallocated. Maybe that involves pathways or a playground or setbacks or height limits or whatever, but it's thoughtfully thought about instead of that fragmented process where everybody's fighting with each other and doing nothing. This is a way of actually stepping in and sorting it out for the collective good. And then, of course, the reallocation and going back to the original landowners with their value and knowing how that value has increased substantially through the efforts of the entrepreneurial planner, and being able to reallocate those adjusted pots. Perhaps that means that family gets a nice new apartment in this new housing complex. Perhaps it means that they get several apartments also for grandma who'd been living with them, squashed up in the back room. So it's all a way of reorganizing with a good purpose and in good faith. And this is a really interesting tool for fragmented and possibly destroyed communities. Of course, I've mentioned already in passing land value recapture, and it's become very much the vogue of urban planning, is how to grab land value for the common good. It's partly come about because we're not directly doing as much as we used to, and so we're having to rely on market mechanisms to get value. That's not to say it's not a good thing. It's just that it's like having one hand tied behind your back. But it's important, though, that it's land value or betterment, we in some call it, that is utilised for the common good. So, of course, we see the UK specialising it with its Section 106 arrangements. We also see the Irish having a go. So the Anglos and also the US are real champions of all these kind of land value capture approaches, which the OECD recently got very excited about with the Lincoln Institute, and write a big, thick report, which I also wrote a bit for. But it's complicated, and it's also something which is required when the market is strong, when the market is growing. Then you've got value to capture. But what if it's not? What if it's shrinking? What if it's declining? So So there are also ways which the US have tried to get in there first and improve a area, and later on take the increased value from that for the common good. That's called tax increment financing. There's a very fun, interesting podcast on that by the Lincoln Institute, if you care to go down that pathway. So there's lots and lots of debate about who gets what from land capture. And this was just an interesting diagram from Just Economics. And you might care to explore that report by them a little bit further, where they take a good critical look at the way in which public decisions in relation to land use are actually shared. And also what's really interesting at this moment is that the Irish government is just about to pass a law which sets a, if you like, a land value basis, and by doubling, if you like, the density potential of Dublin, they're going to capture half of that value increase for housing programs in city. And I think the National Economic and Social Council has been writing about it. The City of Dublin's been writing about it. So it's very, very contemporary. But what's been going on a long time, since the late 80s, is inclusionary zoning. And again, you've got the US being a front runner. I remember going there in 1993 and looking at 17 different cities and how they did their inclusionary zoning. Some did it very well. And the San Francisco and Boston were standouts. Also Montgomery County near Washington on their density bonus schemes. But there's nothing like a national approach. And the French national law on urban inclusion has ensured well-located and widely distributed social housing is required in municipalities by a national law. So while it took the US 30 years of struggle to get city by city, county by county, and state by state, the French just did it in one law, and you can find more about that easily on the web. You've also got England and Scotland showing different variations of the same theme. In England, they enable sites to be provided for affordable and social housing development through planning contributions and infrastructure contributions, but they don't help much after that. And so most of the housing produced as a result is just what we would call middle and upper income affordable housing, whereas Scotland, which is always strong on public administration, is sensible and uses that land which is provided and combines that with direct public investment to make sure that the kind of housing they need across the city is actually developed. So take a look at Scotland's approach in the UK. And of course, these things are constantly changing and adapting. In the last few years, we've seen Vienna into the ring of players in this type of approach. And Vienna's new zoning obligations are being tested mainly in larger sites where they're being rezoned from one use to another. 2/3 of the development gain is to be used for subsidised housing for a purpose, remember, to accommodate those key workers in particular who make the city a good place to live. So moving on, all these types of tools can be used in combination. And the experts in combining them, I think, are the Finns. So they have these land, housing and transport agreements. That's partly bringing together money that they collect as a central government, which mainly collect all the income taxes, and they're rich and can borrow cheaply. So they then, together with municipalities which have land and have planning powers, they come together and make agreements to do and ensure certain development occurs that municipalities alone couldn't do. So working together, multi-level governance, using the power of governments to raise long-term low-cost finance, using the power of municipal governments over land policy, over uses, is really what's embodied in the Finnish MAL agreements, the MAL, unfortunate name, MAL agreements. And again, that's in Housing 2030. But we've also got a good example of an evidence-based approach to doing a similar sort of thing. And the cunning Scots, who are always very clever, as I mentioned, with public administration, they have devised a special housing needs and demand assessment where they combine evidence on where the need is with money to make things happen, to address those needs. And the Berlin social city is also a way of doing that in a nice, sensitive way at a neighborhood level. So they combine these long-term goals with strategic investments. Taxes are vital, although a lot of people don't like them very much. But at the end of the day, they're the things that make our communities really much better places to live. If there's enough revenues that are filling the coffers of the municipal government, that they're well expended, that they're used to borrow further investments that can be paid off over generations. So taxes are vital, but unfortunately there's been a trend towards cutting them back and reducing them, which of course reduces our quality of urban life significantly. And you can see certainly the difference in low tax and high tax countries, the quality of life and the inequality of opportunities. A low tax and low urban environmental approach delivers. So land value taxation is a key part of that. And we know that land values have been growing enormously. It is a scarce resource, a finite resource, and the way in which we tax it is an opportunity for communities too. Vacancy taxation is also something that can be utilized. What about all those vacant properties in the cities in Ukraine? Isn't there a better way in which they could be mobilized to be used, or at least the revenue from a vacancy taxation could be used to fund more appropriate housing programs as well? And you see that happening now in Vancouver, which established a vacancy tax only 2 or 3 years ago. And it has now been able to bring together millions actually to fund local housing programs. But we also see cities taking a more assertive role in regulating land short-term letting, also national governments choosing or not choosing to be homes to global corporate investors in the rental market, especially at the bottom end. And we see a very different approach being taken at countries like Germany, Denmark, and UK. And there's a great article online, free access by Corpus Alphas on this. So what land policies are relevant to your context? Well, we haven't had much success with that Mentimeter thing, but you might want to just think about, again, what are the tools? If you could write them down and maybe share them in the chat or share some ideas at least. Thinking about, I've spoken about tools, I've talked about how they were applied, but of course in your environment, it's totally different, and how the potential for their use, their design and application will depend on a lot of things, including your capacity and your authority to do so. So just moving on to land policy in the context of recovery, this is a picture of Dili in East Timor, where the occupying forces left and didn't like to leave behind things neat and tidy, and of course burned many of the homes. And this is the central city. People who had fled came back, and there was ad hoc occupation. People just, of course, do what they can, and they stay in any kind of shelter that they feel is secure, at least for the time being. So they tried to work out, international organisations, a way in which these public and abandoned properties could be allocated or or in a way which made sense for the chaos of the time on a short-term, medium-term, long-term basis, because the allocation on a long-term basis of somebody else's property can cause a lot of problems down the track. So, of course, they made later on the establishment of an effective land cadastre, land administration, and so on, to minimise the risk of further conflicts that could occur through an informal market taking place in the occupancy of some of these dwellings. So effective land administration was a really mechanism for security, for stability, for public purpose. It also establishes overarching norms for how we do development. We don't do it just by land grabbing, by opportunism, by profiteering, but we do it in an orderly way. We set rules for ownership and the restitution of property that is fair and just, that shapes the direction of development of fair and social and economic structures, will eventually, of course, settle in a way which enable a certain type of investment to flow. Hopefully, that flow of investment is one which builds societies and doesn't divide them. So it will, of course, also impact on the spatial development of the city, the level of overcrowding or undercrowding, the quality of the homes, the health of people who live there, their movement around, their freedom of movement as well as the sanctity of some of the agricultural land that might need to be protected from sprawling use. Think again of sprawling Brussels and compact Amsterdam, and those cows that you can see virtually from the canals of Amsterdam almost. So ecological and environmental biodiversity will also be subject to the way in which the land rules and the development potential and intensity are also established, something which is very much the subject of the previous session last week. Because, of course, contamination and ecological damage is going to be a major issue. We've got municipalities which lack capacity for active land policies, which is an issue which Oleksandr is really passionate about and has been involved in trying to address through the new European Bauhaus courses. But we'll also see issues around shrinking cities and declining land values. And of course, that will have consequences for those land-based tax revenues I mentioned. So I'm going to hand over to my esteemed colleague, Oleksandr Anisimov now, who can talk to you much more about what tools could possibly be relevant to the Ukrainian context. So thanks for your attention, and sorry that I'm not very good with the Mentimeter, but I hope that you find the material useful on the web eventually, and please note that there are videos in there and web links to some interesting resources.
Julia, I suggest we have some kind of a short discussion maybe, rather than just jumping right to my presentation. I see Alexei Selivanov asking about the relationship between ghost cities and banking and land banking preparation. China. How do you see that connection maybe? You see it in the comments section in the chat.
Oh, I see it. Yeah. In your opinion, are these Chinese ghost cities a sign of kind of land banking preparation? Well, in a way, they were the overuse of this particular tool. And there's quite a bit of research on this in on the web, and also we do refer to it in that report by Lawson and Wanavara. So obviously, in competing for jobs, in competing for development, the cities went too far and over-provided for. And perhaps there are other issues we don't know about in terms of relationships with development companies, which led to the overproduction of the dwellings. So I think the different circumstances in different cities. But it's a really interesting topic. The ghost cities in China were actually more that nobody was living in these places. So, you know, the anticipated rural urban drift, the competition and attracting workers from other cities, it didn't happen. So therefore, what would you conclude is that they were out of touch with the actual needs and population movements of people. They didn't have good evidence-based urban plans that were able to say what they need. And maybe for that insight, they should go and talk to the Scots in their housing needs demand assistance and the way in which they built the capacity for knowing what indicators were necessary to inform the provision of housing for particular segments of the housing market, but also to provide for the community and also employment and economic development there. Is there any other questions? I'm looking on the chat. Was it because it was just up to down, a top-down procedure? Well, it's an interesting combination because municipalities drive it rather than national governments, but it could be a number of different things. Typically, you need a bit of both national framework vision, accountability, transfer of funding. So I think a multi-level governance approach where you recognise the capacities, authority and resources of different levels of government combined with the know-how, knowledge, sensitivity and democratic relevance of local communities. Together they're stronger, as long as they respect each other's roles. No, any more?
Yeah, I think we can move on.
Okay.
I guess people could have some questions regarding Ukraine as well. Do you see my screen?
Yeah.
Yes, we do. Thank you,
Okay.
Julia.
Thank you, Julie. That was a very impressive presentation of land policy tools. And I think I won't match the scope and the depths, but I will try to draw some ideas and relations to Ukrainian conditions and the way I perceive the things that have to be dealt with rather than just describing the whole conditions of Ukrainian land use planning. Here you have a link and the QR code to the research we were talking about. It's available both in Ukrainian and in English. It's quite accessible and I think you will find it quite interesting. It relates to some of the issues I will raise today. And it also provides a lot of ideas regarding how to solve those issues based on international cases. So my point today would be that a specific way in which Ukrainian land policy functions today is that even though the Soviets in 1920s nationalized the land rights and land in the country, since 1980s, late 1980s, early 1990s, step by step, the country and the national institutions forgot the way how to deal with land. They stopped measuring the land take. They stopped gathering data on land use. Some of the institutional links were broken and others were not used anymore. And the way, you know, the knowledge in the country regarding land use came into some kind of a very dark place where it was stashed or forgotten or just thrown away. And there was an expectation that some magic forces of the market will take on the land use. However, as we recall, Ukraine is one of the last countries in the world where we still have a moratorium on land sale, which is going to be somehow resolved in the part of the reform that was going to happen before the war, but now it's a little bit on hold. So my position here is that we had knowledge how to deal with land use, and we could use it as soon as we didn't forget it, or as long as we didn't forget it, but we did. And now we have to learn again, maybe based on some of the remaining abilities or opportunities the cities have to deal with land, maybe based on some other sectors, such as ecological policies and other that have retained at least some idea of the land use. Just maybe for Ukrainian participants, there was this, there is always a discussion about terms, and I think it's crucial because we never use such combination of words as land use policy. And particularly important in Ukraine is that land policy in Ukraine is used only in regards to agricultural lands or agricultural land use. It's never used in regard to urban land policy. And I think this is really crucial for us to rethink those concepts and to add new layers and new senses and new meanings to those existing. But what we actually use regarding land use policy in urban areas, that is the focus of today's lecture and discussion, is land management and urban development. So two concepts that are used in various cases in Ukraine, and I think those concepts are both misleading in regards to land use because they do not join the housing development or the retail development or infrastructure development to the specifics of land management, which are set in a bit technical way in Ukrainian legislation and Ukrainian policy in the cities. So these concepts are used, but are used in disconnection, and really there is a need for us to drive land use policy thinking about how to deliver a sustainable environment and how to deliver a sustainable future for the cities. So what I was thinking about is, this is based on the presentation on the report that I just mentioned. So there is some kind of a simple but quite clear evidence, which is not systematized because we don't have any national institute working on this topic, but which can be observed in a case-by-case study, is that land policy is presumably non-existent. However, there is planning policy, and that planning policy allows for all of the super dense or medium dense but highly inefficient neighborhoods, which result in the places that lack public facilities, that lack green infrastructure, that lack transportation, that lack social mix, that lack identity, that lack low or zero carbon planning systems. All of these are somehow the result of the absence of purposeful and value-driven land policy. And in our cases, we don't have any specific land use policies, at least on the national level in Ukraine. We, however, have spatial planning policies. And we had an attempt to bring those two ideas closer in 2020. And there was a merger of digital cadastral maps and spatial planning documentation. So since 2021, spatial planning and land use documentation is the same thing. However, the focus is always on spatial planning in every discussion. I think that matters how you use the words, and it matters how you plan for things. It might be a high quality change if it's implemented properly on municipal level. However, we haven't seen any comprehensive plans that are envisioned yet to come. So they were not, they were commissioned, but none of them is existing or is legally adopted. We know there is a lot of discretion in permits and construction and real estate projects. However, this is not, just the Ukrainian case. It really matters what we mean by discretion, because discretion is just a legal term of using the space that law gives to an institution. And it can be used purposefully, it can be ignored, or it can be used to somebody's vested interest, for instance, or corruption interest. So discretion is not bad by itself, but the discretion is rarely, in Ukrainian cases, rarely used to the benefit of public. And that relates to, issues of the capacity and quality of municipal personnel on the local level. So this kind of a small diagram with the Ukrainian USSR flag just draws our attention, or my attention, to the issue that there is no rethinking of the purposeful, spatial and land policy vision for the future that we are planning to have in the future. So we are kind of still in this amendment phase or a transitionary phase to something which we do not see in the land of the story. I'd rather now go to the points that I wanted to focus you regarding the recovery, because we need to plan for new housing recovery, and that is going to happen one way or another, whether we have a spatial planning reform or we don't, whether we have enough capacity or quality of personnel or we don't. And that really means that we have to focus on things at hand that are relevant and that are crucial for recovery. So these are three of them, and I'll start with the first one is how do I see the need to merge housing needs and spatial planning, which is obviously the land use planning. So here, our issue is that, as I said, legally, land use is inserted in spatial planning, but it's inserted just on a formal level without any substantive clauses or substantive measures to be taken regarding, for instance, housing placement or quality or typology or variations or tenure of housing that's going to be built. And particularities of that is that it's all goes down back to the classical format of owner-occupied housing development in the end, because nothing is prescribed in spatial planning documentation. And they exist on their own because spatial planning does not resemble or does not reflect housing planning, planning for housing or housing needs. And in a sense, even that, spatial planning now has this land use elements in it, they're still empty shells. And I would say that there is some of those ideas were mentioned by Julie, and they're not impossible to implement, but they require dedication on behalf of municipalities and dedication on behalf of the people involved in the policymaking, that those things actually find their way in Ukrainian policy. So I would say there are 5 categories of missing housing requirements that deliver high quality living environments, accessible and affordable for people to use and live in. And those are ownership and tenure requirements, that there is a diversity of tenures that is informing the differential neighborhoods or the differences in the neighborhoods inside them. There are typology issues because we do not actually have a lot of variation in the neighborhoods that are being built in case of physical typology of the construction, and also respectful to the needs of people, such as intergenerational housing, shared spaces, and so on. So I can try to kind of mention all of them, but the planning policies don't respond to a single solution. They kind of integrate all of those requirements if they're used together. So the morphology issue is obviously clearly important. It's tied to typology's issue because it responds to different densities regarding the neighborhoods, the integration to other neighborhoods, to neighboring places, also existence of effective and used common spaces that are either public gardens, some shared facilities, meaningful cultural areas, and so on. Obviously, there is a need to think about accessibility of that housing and targeted groups that should be included in the land policy making. And regarding the last point is the affordability issue, which can be put in the land use planning issues, where we see that housing is developed for specific social groups, where we can have targeted loans, we have targeted subsidies that allow for those the different typologies and different tenures to actually happen if they are designed and attached and linked to banking legislation, to land use legislation, to development legislation and funding sources. And planning policy tools are just the ones that we discussed earlier with Julie, are the renewal programs for older existing neighborhoods, inclusionary zoning for rezoning of neighborhoods, developer contracts where the cities put their interests and put their requirements forward and make developers respond to that requirements. And we have also municipal land banking and planning for municipal land use, and social housing quotas in the development, similar to inclusionary zoning, with new facilitative mechanisms of housing development. So we would say that if we are missing those housing requirements, the spatial planning, if those things are left unattended, we would be unable to meet those local social housing quotas and goals and ensure quality of built projects. However, if we actually take attention, if we put effort in delivering those housing requirements to the built environment in the recovery, we're able to create several benefits to secure those investments with high quality spatial planning documentation, to create a housing investment framework in Ukrainian municipalities, to create opportunity for public oversight and control, as each of those instruments actually deliver more public oversight and more attention and transparency on behalf of the project developers. The second case, or the second area of action, is the planning tools for redevelopment. And I put redevelopment separately because it's often discussed. Often all of these measures are somehow focused on greenfield development or maybe brownfield redevelopment, but we rarely talk about issue of existing neighborhoods. And those neighborhoods actually need different types of land use planning instruments and instruments that allow, to secure property rights, but also to deliver the needed densification or change of tenure or upgrade and so on. And in Ukraine, we have those fractured ownership patterns of those buildings where people own parts of the building, some of the rights are not registered. Most of the buildings are in poor shape and have not been refinanced by any funding or any circular funds. There is little or at all no state or municipal funds for substantive renovation. And all of these buildings receive huge energy subsidies, increasing Ukrainian fossil fuel dependence and creating a loop of the budget inefficiency and constant subsidizing instead of modernizing. And actually, we know a lot of cases in regards to the infill development and high quality redevelopment issues, but we can imagine how much effort on behalf of the municipality it took to actually design, plan, and implement this high quality change. And if we are talking about modernistic districts, which became places that had to be densified or they had to be replanned, there was a lot of effort, a lot of instruments used at once to deliver the change and to preserve, quality of the environment and to increase it actually by differentiating, uses, by creating new spaces, by giving more functionality and access to different social facilities. And I would put together, what I would call a system of district renewal with the aims to provide new homes, decarbonize the housing stock, and create the quality environment with a lot of tools. Such tools include planning development instruments for the district renewal, effective process and project management of these renewal projects, necessary shift in ownership structure, and pooling funding from various sources. So these tools would allow municipalities to use projects and to make the change in district level happen by integrating the values of European Green New Deal, SDGs, European Bauhaus towards high quality living environment. And is yet to happen. I haven't seen any moves in that direction other than complete demolition of the neighborhoods and full rebuilding of the area. So we would obviously benefit by adhering to new Green Deal and CO2 goals, so embedded in construction, but also decreasing the amount of concrete and fuel needed to redevelop those buildings and create much longer building lifetime for the neighborhoods. And obviously, on the risk, the first point is further decay of the stock. It is completely independent or completely unrelated to the war happening. It was ongoing before the war, and we are looking at a situation that has to be tackled one way or another. Otherwise, we're going to have to heavily think about how to actually deal with the demolition of buildings that were never touched by war, but were so poorly maintained that they need to be rebuilt. And the last important point to address in the recovery, I would say, regarding to land use is the inconsistent legislation capacity of armadas. I guess you've been in some way already working with that issue in your research or any other case. I would say this is a research from other connections. It's a bit dated, but we can imagine that things did not change that much because of COVID first, and then the war started. There were much more urgent issues to respond to. So it's a survey of 30 municipalities about their ability or their, we called it completeness of the spatial planning instruments in that municipality. And it seems that less than half of the hromadas have the general plan. So we are not talking about sectoral strategies. We're not talking about land use schemes. We're not talking about integrated development programs. We are talking about basic spatial planning documentation. It was not there. How could we expect, and how do we expect the recovery to go smoothly if we did not even know how to plan hromadas before the war, is a question of great importance. And I think it has to be tackled quite soon, but with the strategic means and strategic research rather than just pressure on the municipalities. But what's been happening is that there is been just the programs of comprehensive recovery that were thrown over the existing requirements for the development of instruments, rather than decrease of those instruments and strategic hierarchy of those instruments to create purposeful and linear, I would say, strategies for development, especially for the smaller municipalities that really need sectoral strategies to develop. However, we have a lot of evidence that, the strategic and spatial plans, even if they existed, were outdated. There was a lack of qualified personnel to manage incoming funds and projects. There was weak municipal capacity in developing strategies and setting monitoring indicators. However, we know that there are policy actions that can be used to respond to those issues. It's the merging of the instruments. It's the push for national and international knowledge learning on project management. It's the streamlining of monitoring practices and data convergence that would all assist municipalities in setting their agenda, putting the legislation that they need to provide, they need to create in some hierarchy, in some strategic hierarchy, and then push for real spatial planning change and spatial planning projects. Obviously, we'll have a lot of benefits if this issue of inconsistency of legislation and lack of capacity will be resolved. It's synchronization of spatial and economic recovery priorities. We'll have legal convergence for implementation of capacity building and technical assistance. I'll have a lot of more alignment in the implementation of incoming social housing projects, infrastructure projects, and so on regarding the economic and policy goals. The inefficient and aligned projects, so-called white elephants, are yet to emerge, but believe me, they're going to happen, and duplication of or triplication or foplication of municipalities' efforts on developing a variety of unnecessary instruments on the local level is also going to happen unless the ministry and the government will not respond to the issue of ineffectiveness of development of such a huge amount of spatial planning and development programs and plans. So I would wrap up by trying to give you some directions from different sides. So I would consider the left side of this scheme to be an expert's involvement or expert's assistance or potential for furthering the agenda of good quality spatial and land use planning development is to assist the government and in developing and amending new legislation for spatial and land use planning. Obviously, it has to be initiated by the government, but yet they were on pause with this issue. On the behalf of Ukraine, there is obviously a need to go for introducing housing requirements in planning documentation and permits for the municipalities to plan for housing specifics as you just described. If we're talking about international assistance and other expert involvement, it's development of programs and guidelines to both building recovery and area-based renewal. And I'm talking about existing neighborhoods, which are going to be the hot topic of discussion for the upcoming recovery, completely overtaking, I would say, the issue of new construction in the upcoming years. And in Ukrainian side, I would urge the government to introduce comprehensive legal planning instruments for those areas that can be efficiently and simply used for redevelopment and change of tenure in the area if the buildings are yet to be demolished or reconstructed. And the last but not the least is municipal capacity priorities, capacity and priorities design, is that there is a potential to build capacity in the municipalities to increase the focus on spatial and land use issues related to planning and funding absorption. And this is where the international donors, the international assistance can really provide a lot of help. But however, Ukraine has to merge strategic documents and introduce clear guidance on planning priorities for communities to take the issue in their hands and move on sustainably forward. So that was it from my side. I'm really open for questions that we don't have time for, but I'm sorry, I tried to be as fast as possible. It just took me a little bit more than I expected. Thank you.
Thank you a lot. So yeah, if anybody's having questions, you see Oleksandr's mail. I think we'll also share it on the website later. So you can contact and text him, also Julius. Hello, yeah.
Yeah.
Is it correct? Yeah, people can ask. Yeah, we are about to finish. I don't know if anybody's having any questions that we can very fast, or maybe urgent things you want to ask, we can still ask. Write it in the chat. If not, just contact Oleksandr and Julia later. Well, thank you very much, Julia and Oleksandr. The cases and strategies you've shared are very valuable and interesting. They're also very comprehensive topics, and we have a lot to learn and try in future. Thank you all very much for participating in this course. As you know, that was our last session, 8th session. And despite some technical problems, we are very satisfied with the result of this course in general. Yeah, I also want to thank people without whom this course would not have happened. It's Roberto Rocco and Caroline Newton, our usual hosts and moderators. Unfortunately, today they were not able to be with us, as they are opening their summer school planning and design for the Just City. However, they send their regards, and Roberto will keep in touch with all of you via email. Yeah, I've seen lots of thanking messages in the group chat. Yeah, of course, as we said before, for those who wish to obtain a certificate and who have attended at least 6 out of 8 sessions, detailed instruction of how to submit the final assignment can be found at our website, the chapter Final Assignment. So a short 3-minute movie, or as an option, a short essay of around 1,000 words. So please follow the instruction carefully, and if you have any questions, you can also write to postconflictbk@tudelf.nl. Yeah, the deadline for assignments is the 1st of September, and the assignment criteria, submission, and grading descriptions can all be found at the website. Yeah, so thanks a lot. That was our last session. I hope you enjoyed it and found it interesting. Yeah. We'll see you in emails. Oh.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Bye. Keep in touch.
Bye-bye.
Thank
It was
you.
nice having you here. Thank you for the invitation. Bye.
Yeah.
Bye-bye, guys.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you very much, Pavlo. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Take care.